Today is November 16th, 2023, and my guest is journalist Haviv Rettig Gur. His last name is Gur, G-U-R. Haviv is a senior analyst for the English language newspaper at the Times of Israel. Haviv, welcome to EconTalk.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
We have two topics for today. The first, we're going to take an historical look at European Jew hatred, anti-Semitism. And the second is the current situation here in Israel as the war in Gaza enters its sixth week, and we'll see some of the ties between those two events. Now, the first part of the conversation is based on a column we'll link to you did back in April of this year, long before the war, and it stuck with me. I thought about asking you to do an interview on it even before the war. That piece was called "The Forgotten Horrors That Hide in the Holocaust's Long Dark Shadow." And you begin by saying the Holocaust is thought of as this terrible, unique catastrophe for the Jews, and of course that's true in some sense, but the genocidal uniqueness is a bit misleading. You write, quote, "The 20th century was already among the bloodiest periods in Jewish history before the start of the genocide. That includes the flight of millions of Jews out of Europe and the way those who remain were delivered into the Nazi embrace by Western immigration quotas. It is a version of the story that begins not in 1939 or 1941, but in 1880. Explain, why do we need to go back to 1880?
It's a good question. There is a European Jewish experience of the 20th century. We'll call it the long 20th century, from roughly 1881. In 1881, a anarchist group, activist group, assassinates the Tsar of Russia. They had tried multiple times. They finally succeed. This is Tsar Alexander I, a profoundly reformist Tsar, a Tsar who had in the 1860s abolished serfdom, and a Tsar who apparently on the morning of his assassination, he was assassinated in the afternoon. On the morning of, he gave the order to draw up some kind of a constitutional document ahead of the establishment of a serious parliament for the Russian Empire. He was a reformist who looked at Western Europe and said, I want Russia to be brought into the modern age. But for these anarchists, that wasn't enough. They viewed these reforms as a way to preserve with, I think, some justification, a way to preserve the prevailing social classes rather than abolish them and bring equality. And they killed him. They managed to kill him. It was a clumsy thing, but it was ultimately successful. And the Tsar, Alexander I, was replaced by his son, Alexander II. Now, his son was a very different kind of man, a very conservative one, educated on Russian Orthodox religious teachings, uninterested in the reforms. In fact, blamed the reformist impulses of his father for his father's ultimate death, and began a massive crackdown on everything that he came to view as enemies of the Russian Empire, reversed most of his father's reforms. He didn't reinstitute serfdom, but he did reverse many of his father's reforms. And part of that was passing a year later into his reign of the May Laws. The May Laws were anti-Semitic laws passed by the Tsarist regime. It's a very short, I think on Wikipedia people can find the 10 sentences or so that make up the May Laws, but essentially it further limited the already very strict limitations on where Jews can live and what employment they could pursue and education, and essentially narrowed Jewish life. But another thing happened in the wake of the assassination of the Tsar, and it was something that the Russian Empire didn't expect and didn't want. And it had a lot to do with industrialization, and it had a lot to do especially with railroads and electrification of the empire. And it mostly occurred in southern Russia, the southern Russian Empire, and basically what is today Ukraine, cities like Odessa. And that was the beginning of mass popular pogroms, started bottom up, where Jews and non-Jews lived together. And pogromists would march down the streets of cities in what would today be, I guess, Western Ukraine, and attack Jewish homes, catch Jews in the streets, sometimes kill, often beat. Really in 1881, and very, very quickly, Pogroms spread from one city to the next. And there are these fascinating sociological studies of these early pogroms that they really did follow the rail network. And they were often spread by rail workers. And so there was, it was an anti-Semitism that was in some sense driven by a lot of the industrializing changes that were happening to Russian society, the Russian imperial society at the time, which included urbanization and the the weakening economically of the peasant class. That serfdom was abolished, but not everybody benefited from it in the same way. There are all these complex and fascinating historical reasons for this sudden outburst, bottom up of waves of pogroms that essentially would last at least 40 years. In other words, over the next 40 years, they would get steadily worse. Some of these pogroms became very, very famous. The pogrom in 1903 in Kishinev. Every Jew knows the name Kishinev. Now, they don't know the name Kishinev because they're familiar with modestly sized towns in Moldova. They know the name Kishinev because in 1903 there was this pogrom. Roughly 50 people were killed, Jews were killed in this pogrom. But what caught the Jewish imagination and turned Kishinev into a rallying cry throughout the Jewish world wasn't the 50 dead. It was how they died. It was the cruelty of the pogromists. It was the way that women were captured and raped in front of their husbands and fathers and brothers. It was the humiliation, the dehumanization, the emasculation of Jewish men. Hebrew poets like Chaim Nachman Bialik famously wrote about these men who carry the burden of that moment when they were forced to watch the rape and then murder, often of their loved ones. And so you had, in Kielce and many other places, you had all throughout the Russian Empire, decade after decade, these bottom-up pogroms. In many places, now the Jews believed, because it came with the May laws, because it came with this crackdown and reactionary political impulse of the new czar, the Jews believed that this was a regime act. In other words, that the regime instigated it. But historians generally agree that Jewish belief at the time is probably a mistake, a misunderstanding of the internal mechanisms of Russian politics and society around them, and that actually something much worse was happening, which is that it was genuine and authentic and popular and bottom up. The people around them, around whom they had lived, really wanted them gone and really wanted them tortured and dehumanized until they understood the point. And in many places, the Tsarist police actually saw the pogroms as a threat to public order and ultimately a threat to imperial rule. And so there were attempts to crack down on these, and they were largely unsuccessful by the regime. In some places like Kishinev, for example, the global outcry, the Jewish outcry, which in places like the United States or Britain where you had influential Jews, that translated also into governmental outcry against Russia. This caused the Russian Empire real diplomatic damage. And Kishinev inspired the writing of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion by supporters of the regime, of the Russian imperial regime, who couldn't understand why the world cared that Jews had died. And so they saw this the diplomatic blowback, and that really made them, start to think in conspiratorial. They'd already thought in conspiratorial terms of the Jews, but it made them want to explain it and create an anti-Jewish politics that was more explicit, also to validate, the pogroms themselves and to really create an intellectual level of this.
The protocols of the Elders of Zion were attributed to the Jews, but were actually not written to the Jews. It was an alleged plan for worldwide domination that was used to incite hatred.
Right. And one of the justifications given at the time of their first publication in Russian was there's no other explanation for why the world cares about what happened in Kishinev, right? And so these pogroms reshaped the Jewish world. Now, they reshaped the Jewish world both mentally. They also reshaped the Jewish world demographically. They led to, just one last point about the cost. These pogroms cost the Russian Empire a very great deal. The Jews began to leave Russian imperial lands in their millions, probably 3 million over the course of 40 years. Of those 3 million, again, it's a rough estimate, give or take a couple 100,000, right? of those 3 million, the vast majority, 2.5 million roughly, went to America. And that is the demographic bulk of what is today American Jewry. There had been a German Jewish, American Jewish community beforehand, but that the demographic bulk is actually that flight from Eastern Europe. All the generation of Jews in New York that Mel Brooks makes fun of in his comedy career, the 2,000-year-old man, right? Those are his parents who are these fleeing Jews. The pogromist experience, the experience of the pogroms, it hurt the Russian Empire, because as these Jews fled, many of them fled into westward, but to the closest place they could, which was the Austro-Hungarian or the German empires. And the Austro-Hungarian and German empires were absolutely convinced that this was Russia trying to dump its Jewish problem on them, and they were also fairly anti-Semitic. There were not the kinds of pogroms you had in Russia, but they didn't want these Jews. And the diplomatic tension caused by these fleeing Jews, by these other empires who didn't want the Jews and were convinced this was a Russian, intentional policy, actually led to the Russian Empire, which was in financial straits, losing credit lines with these other empires. And so the Jews were fleeing, the Russians were pushing them out. It was both top down and bottom up at the same time. And that is the beginning of 60 years of the steady, not just emptying out of Europe of its Jews, but the conscious, willful, purposeful, systematic making of Europe uninhabitable to Jews, literally uninhabitable. And in different parts of Eastern Europe, it happened at different rates. Eventually, it gets to Central Europe and then even Western Europe. It happens at different times. It happens in different ways. But it happened, and it happened systematically. In the 1920s, the Romanians kicked the Jews out of or severely limit Jewish access to higher education. In 1938, this was one example I used in that essay, because the Poles have a story they tell now about how Nazis killed Polish Jews, not Poles. And the truth is, of course, much, much more complex. In 1938, there were no Nazis in control of Poland, but Poland actually stripped Jews who hadn't lived in Poland, Polish Jews who hadn't lived in Poland for the previous 5 years, passed a law stripping them of citizenship in order to ensure they don't come back. And the Nazi regime was so scared that they would be saddled with many tens of thousands, I'm not clear on exactly the number, of Polish Jews who are no longer Polish citizens, and so they're stuck on German soil, that they rounded up 17,000 of these Jews and stuck them on the border with Poland, demanded the Poles take them back. The Poles refused, and these Jews are actually stuck in a sort of miniature concentration camp in between these two countries with absolutely nowhere to go. No one rescues them. The Polish deputy ambassador to London says if the West doesn't take them in, then their fate will be persecution until they flee. And they're essentially there until they're murdered, at the beginning of the war.
I think it's important, listeners may not realize that the 6 million Jews in the Holocaust who were murdered between 1941 to 45, with some before that, but the bulk murder between 41 and 45, they weren't Germans. There weren't very many Jews in Germany. It's one of the stranger parts of this tragedy. They were Jews in Poland, who weren't in those 17,000 who had been expelled, but hundreds and hundreds of thousands, I think over 1 million Jews in Poland, and the Jews in Russia who didn't leave in the aftermath of pogroms and persecution in the period 1880 to 1940. You provide a remarkable a set of facts that I had never been aware of. As you say, 2.5 million of the 3 million Russian Jews come to America, as did many others. It wasn't just Jews who struggled with poverty and persecution and tough lives and were looking for something better. Obviously, in this period of, say, 1880 to 1920, massive immigration into the United States from Ireland, from Italy, from Poland, Hungary, Russia, mostly Jews, but also non-Jews. And it's a shocking thing. You say that between 1908 and 1925, Many of these immigrants to America decided they didn't like America so much. They were going to go back. 57% of Italians, 40% of Poles, 64% of Hungarians, 67% of Romanians, and 55% of Russians. Among the Jews, the figure was just 5%. And your conclusion, you say the Jews stuck it out in America through thick and thin, prosperity and recession. Other immigrants were seeking a better life. The Jews were running away. There was no better life than America, even when it wasn't so great, compared to what they had left. And I think that's really rather remarkable.
Absolutely. It's an astonishing data point because it tells the story, right? In 1907, there was a crash. There was the panic of 1907. That's why the data begins in 1908, this mass sort of wave of returnees. The economy takes a dip. There aren't really jobs for people without good English, without family connections, without higher education. You can't really move up the social ladder in America in the immediate aftermath of 1907. And there are these periodic market corrections that are quite painful. And there's, of course, no modern welfare state at the time and all of that. And yeah, these immigrants say, this isn't working. We're sitting here on the Lower East Side starving. And so we're going back to Italy, where at least we have a village, we have a farm, we have something. The non-Jews also came very differently, in a very different way. They sent young men first to establish themselves, find jobs, rent an apartment. Then the families came a year later, 5 years later, sometimes 10 years later. And so it was all done very comfortably. America was expanding, and the American economy was expanding, and these people were coming in to help that expansion, and America welcomed them. The Jews were running away. The Jews came as families. They landed in New York Harbor, by and large, not every single time, but by and large, as whole families. There was no one coming ahead of them. Jewish organizations were set up by the American Jewish community at the time, desperately trying to help these people land. I think the American Jewish community at the time, educated guess, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's something like 250,000 Jews, mostly German speakers, many of them settled in the Midwest. That's why to this day you have a major Reformed Jewish rabbinical school called Hebrew Union College. The central Reformed rabbinical school in America is in Cincinnati, Ohio. Because in the mid-19th century, the Jewish immigration was part of the German-speaking immigration that settled in the Midwest. And I think to this day, Germans are the second largest or maybe the third largest minority in America. They're so big they don't know they exist, is how big they are, right? But you have all these Midwestern cities with operas, right? Milwaukee has an opera. St. Louis has an opera. Cincinnati, Ohio has an opera. That's this 19th century German immigration, and there was a large Jewish immigration then. That middle class, formerly German-speaking, well-established, often Midwestern Jewish community is suddenly absorbing a wave of refugees over about 40 years that is 5, 7, maybe 10 times its size. And they're desperate and they're poor.
And now we come to the Holocaust, and you point out a much underappreciated or unknown fact. And I think this is true of authoritarian cruelty generally. To oppress a nation, whether it's Nazi Germany oppressing the Jews or the Soviet Union oppressing its own citizens in the name of protecting the power of the leaders, you need a lot of help. You can't do it on your own. Countries are large generally. They have lots of territory to cover. A police state, another way to say it, a police state can't really thrive by having the police everywhere. They just can't be everywhere. That's true, by the way, very true in China today or other places that have, authoritarian impulses. They need help. They rely, crucially, tragically, on incentivizing everyday citizens to be part of the authoritarian state, the police state. In the case of the Soviet Union, is well known. I recommend that all my listeners read The Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn or The Gulag by Anne Applebaum, one dramatically longer than the other, but the Solzhenitsyn book has been abridged. I don't like abridgments, but The Gulag Archipelago is 3 volumes in it, I think it's very much worth reading. But basically, you can't make a remark about Stalin that's negative, because your neighbor overhearing it will profit, will report you, and so the eyes of the actual police are extended by the bottom up incentives that thrive in those kind of grotesque, cruel places, and the systematic murder of 6 million people, which was and others, of course, but the Jews were special in the zeal with which the Nazis sought them out. That required the cooperation of local citizens. At the same time, of course, Germany's prosecuting a world war on 2 fronts or more. It's really kind of 3. I guess you could even say 4. I mean, it's a world war. They're in a lot of places other than Asia, the Germans, the Nazis are. And at the same time, they're running a massive campaign to systematically exterminate the Jews of Europe. And they get a lot of help.
Yes, there's one step we have to make before that step. And that is, of course, the end of the story, at least of European Jewry, as it had been before. But that last step is the quotas. The Jews are fleeing westward. The European nations are systematically closing themselves to the Jews, making their life literally untenable. And then in 1921, the United States Congress it passes something called the Emergency Quota Act. The Americans have been trying since 1910 to slow this Jewish immigration, but the pressure on the Jews is only increasing to the point where there's this kind of intensity in the Russian Civil War, 1918 to 1921. The Mensheviks, the Bolsheviks, right, the White Russians, the Red Russians, the Ukrainian nationalists, all these different armies, all these different forces in this very chaotic civil war come across Jewish villages, massacre Jews. Estimates are hard to come by. I have read pretty good estimates at 100,000. There are estimates estimating, 150,000 and above murdered Jews who were not part of any of these armies. And so the intensity of the violence and the brutality is still increasing in the early 1920s. In 1921 alone, well over 120,000 Jews just in 1921 land in New York Harbor. And Congress decides to act, and it passes the Emergency Quota Act, which it imposes quotas by nationality. The Jews have no nationality in the American definition at the time. They're either Poles or Russians or something like that. But it is engineered to make sure the Jews don't come. And it works. 3 years later, when they pass the full Quota Act, the Permanent Quota Act, it's down from about 120,000 to 140,000 a year, down to 10,000 a year. And by 1934, after the 1924 Act really goes into effect and there's a few more tweaking of the system, just 2,700 make it into America that year. And the Nazis are already in power, of course, by then. So as the urgency for the Jews escalates, the West closes its doors. It's not just America. It's Canada. It's Britain. It's France. It's Argentina, it's Brazil, it's Australia. Everywhere Jews could go shuts down to them, and that corrals them essentially into the Holocaust.
And we'll talk in another episode down the road about what was happening with Zionism during this period, the desire for a Jewish state, a Jewish homeland. It's intensified by the Kishinev pogrom of 1903 that you mentioned earlier, which occurs roughly 5 years after the beginnings of Zionism as an organized movement. Jews have longed to return to Israel for 2,000 years, but in 1897, as the pogroms that you're talking about start to get fiercer, as European nations become increasingly inhospitable to Jews, and then later as these pogroms become much more murderous, the Jewish population around the world is desperately looking for an asylum, a haven, a place of safety. And it's a combination of security desires with a religious yearning that has been there for 2,000 years. But it obviously, as we know, that doesn't happen until 1948. So in this run-up between the reduction of immigration opportunities, the closing of America and elsewhere, the Jews of Europe find themselves stuck. And the part that's, I think, particularly interesting about your essay is that the effectiveness, the tragic effectiveness of the German efforts to exterminate the Jews of Europe depends very much on how much help they get from the places where the Jews live. And
Right.
as you mentioned in passing, I think it's a half a sentence. It's been very hard for Europe to cope with this. Germany had to cope with it. They have faced it in very many, overwhelmingly, in my view, in admirable ways, as best as they could. But many other nations pretended or just decided not to think about the role they had played in the Holocaust. And different European nations at different times have been forced to, not forced, but have come to grips with this in different ways, some more than others. Again, that's a whole nother conversation. But just the point about the more cooperation the Nazis got from their neighbors, the more Jews were killed.
Yeah, you know what I would like to focus on? I would like to frame everything that we're discussing here as the Jewish experience. Because the Jewish experience is very different from the experience from the Western moral discussion of the Holocaust. The Western moral discussion of the Holocaust is some of it, by the way, informed by American Jews. Is a discussion of the Holocaust that tries to find the sort of psychopolitical origins in which, the lesson of the Holocaust is don't be chauvinist. The lesson of the Holocaust is don't be ethno-nationalist beyond, what did Woody Allen say about anti-Semitism, more than is absolutely necessary, right? In other words, a kind of pro-liberal, relaxed, tolerant ethos. That is the great lesson of the Holocaust. But that's not a lesson of the drawn by the people who experienced the Holocaust. That is a lesson drawn by outsiders who need the Holocaust to have some kind of easy moral lesson that validates themselves. And the actual experience of the actual Jews created new kinds of Jews. And I'm not just talking right now about Zionism. It created new kinds of Haredi Jews. It created new kinds of the entirety of the
Haredi being ultra-Orthodox. Keep going.
Right. So you're absolutely right. The Nazis planned and perpetrated the genocide. They were not successful in the places where locals didn't help. Place after place. And it's not just that there are countries where the locals didn't help, like Denmark, where the Nazis simply were not able to kill the Jews. It's down to inside countries. One great example is Hungary. The Hungarian government in 1944 joined in this Nazi effort to destroy the Jews. The Nazis asked for the Jews, and the Hungarians put about 430,000 Jews on trains and shipped them off to Auschwitz. But they're all Yiddish speakers from the provinces. They're all rural Jews. The middle-class Budapest Jews were not shipped off to Auschwitz because that felt to the government of Hungary horrifying and a kind of culpability that it didn't want to face. And so the Jew that it was uncomfortable to kill because they look too much like us survives the war. The Jews of Budapest survive the war in Hungary. And the Jews of the provinces, the Yiddish speakers, the Hasids, all of those different cultures don't survive. In fact, that's the story of the Holocaust. The Jews who were murdered, something like above 80% of them, were Yiddish-speaking Jews. And you see this in Athens. The Jews of Salonika, the Greeks shipped off very happily. The Jews of Athens, they didn't, and they refused when the Nazis asked for them. Because that, again, was a kind of,
Just to be clear to listeners, when you say they were Yiddish-speaking, meaning they didn't naturally assimilate into the culture that they were living in. They lived apart.
Right.
They had
right. The Jews of Budapest were educated.
Say again?
Right. Yeah, the Jews of Budapest were these educated, westernized. They wore suits. They had, they were lawyers. They were doctors. They were physicists. And then there were these rural, much more religious, Hasidic-looking Jews of the provinces who spoke Yiddish, did not have that modern Western education. They were the ones targeted. And so the point here isn't that, to get to the sort of meat and potatoes of how the Hungarians tried to, they needed the social distance to be able to massacre, to be able to ship them off for the Nazis to massacre. The point is that where the Hungarians were uncomfortable, the Nazis were unable to do the job. And so the fact that the Nazis were able to do the job in 90% of places means that the Nazis did it, planned it, they deserve we need to know that this is a German act. But we also need to understand that it is the culmination of 6 decades of a Europe-wide cultural, political, psychosocial, give me all the words they love cooking up in academia. It is a Europe-wide cultural phenomenon for 6 decades. The Holocaust is its apotheosis. It's its culmination. It is what it was directed toward. It is not an aberration. It didn't begin in 1939, and to understand it, or in, I don't know what the sort of massive uptick in gas chambers in 42 with the final solution decision, or 43, it begins in 1881. And it begins with European country after country determining, sometimes slowly, sometimes quickly, sometimes openly, sometimes quietly, that they don't want to contain the Jews. And I want to just, one last point, everybody knows about the Holocaust. Maybe they don't realize how much collaboration there was, but everybody knows about it. But after the Holocaust, the fundamental story in the Jewish experience doesn't change. The Jews after the Holocaust, those quotas are not lifted. Truman begs Congress to lift the quotas because after the war, the United States military finds itself on German soil with 250,000 Jews behind barbed wire in a whole network of displaced persons camps, and they're feeding them and they are taking care of them, and it's expensive, it's annoying, and they can't get them out. There were about 1 million displaced people with about 8 months after the war. In the immediate aftermath of the war, there were probably 15 million or something like that. A lot of people go home, find a way to get home. But there's 1 million who are unable to get home. Huge numbers, the majority, because they were Nazi collaborators in places now overrun by the Red Army. And if they go home, they die. This is true in Ukraine, in the Baltic states, and other places. Some of them are Polish Catholics. Poland is descending into a kind of civil war in the immediate aftermath of the war. Long story short, there's about 1 million displaced peoples in Europe, probably a quarter of them Jews. And the United States and Britain found something called the International Refugee Organization, which has roughly 40 countries, give or take, 36 countries, who are members of it. And they send representatives to these camps and they interview these DPs. And they want these people to come to their countries. These are from Latin America, from North America, from the West, to help rebuild the economies shattered by the war. Everybody needs working hands. Tens of millions of workers have just been killed, right, in these wars. And so they come to the camps, they interview the DPs, and they take, in 1946, 750,000 DPs who are naturalized and absorbed into their new homes.
DPs meaning being displaced persons, refugees,
right.
What we would call refugees, but at the time they were called DPs, DP camps for these folks.
Right. And they are trapped. Now, what is a DP? A DP is someone with nowhere to go, either because they'll be killed if they go there, so they refuse, or because nobody will take them. And so they're literally not allowed to leave the DP camp. The DPs are behind barbed wire, and that barbed wire is patrolled by British or American, depending on the zone, troops. And many of the DP camps are the concentration camps. So, for example, Bergen-Belsen is liberated after, as the Allies march right eastward through Germany, unless you're an actual inmate of Bergen-Belsen, because you still couldn't leave 2 years later. So were you liberated? I don't want to take away from the Americans and the British the fact that the extermination was stopped. That is not a small thing, obviously. But the Jew in Bergen-Belsen is still in Bergen-Belsen in 1947. That is not what liberation looks like. And there are 250,000 of them. And Truman asks Congress to lift the quotas. Congress refuses again and again. 1945, 6, 7. Jewish groups beg Congress to do so in America. Christian groups come to Congress and beg Congress to lift the quotas. We're not talking about millions more Jews. There aren't millions more Jews. We're talking about these last vestiges of a decimated Jewish world, and nobody will take them in. When do the DP camps empty out? They empty out essentially at the founding of Israel in 1948, so much so that a huge proportion of the Israeli military in 1948 that fights that war of Israel's independence probably a quarter, were DPs. Their experience of that war, their experience of this new Israel, leave aside, ideologies. We're not talking anything, nothing we have talked about here is ideologies. What's fascinating to me is not what tiny ideological elites, how they tell the story of what happened to their peoples. What fascinates me is to just literally trace the experience of the actual people themselves living through these periods. What does it mean for an IDF soldier to be an IDF soldier after 3 years in Bergen-Belsen, after Holocaust, after knowing that his parents and grandparents lived through 6 decades of what we just described? That's the founding of Israel.
IDF being the Israel Defense Forces, which is the Israeli army. Of course, Israel was established in hopes of a very different culture. But if we go back to 1903 and Bialik's poem that you mentioned earlier, that poem was about the cowering of the men you discussed in the face of violence to their wives and daughters. It's a brutal poem. The Holocaust, yes, there were uprisings in Warsaw and elsewhere, but in general, the Jews of Europe were passive victims. I don't think they went to sheep-like slaughter, which is one of the canards that describes that experience, but it's not far off. You can argue that Jews got on the trains to the concentration camps in ignorance of what awaited them, and I think that was true for quite a while. The Nazis were very secretive about what was actually happening. They were called concentration camps, remember, places where people were concentrated, meaning they were taken away. They weren't going to be in the cities and towns and farms of the country. They would be concentrated like a ghetto. And these camps, people took suitcases thinking they were going to have lives in these places for some time. Finally, some people escaped and said they're death camps. But a lot of people didn't believe them. And reasonably so. What do you mean? You mean they're the German people, the people of the great artists and composers and philosophers of the last 300, 500 years? They're systematically murdering people. I mean, it's literally not credible. So there was a great deal of skepticism, and so a lot of people went to their deaths not thinking they were going to their deaths. They thought they were going to persecution or a different kind of savagery than they had faced at home. But ultimately, it came to be known. But the point is that the Jews were murdered in a systematic way without much opposition. And when Israel was established in 1948, and when Arab countries, unhappy and dissatisfied with the UN partition plan of 1947 that we discussed in a recent episode with Yossi Klein Halevi, they were going to fight, and they did. They were grossly outnumbered, grossly under-equipped. Their Air Force was literally a handful of Czech and broken Czech planes that Czech from Czechoslovakia and a few others. It's an extraordinary story. But the point that you're making is, and I think it's one that I did not appreciate, is that the period between 1945, the liberation of the concentration camps, the defeat of the Nazis, and the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 was not a happy time for the people who mercifully survived the war. In fact, some people went back to Poland, and there were pogroms in Poland. Again, a pogrom is when a mob assembles and decides to destroy property and lives and wreak havoc with Jews. There were pogroms in Poland after the war, and this is just, again, not well known. It's horrifying.
It's really extraordinary. Truman actually had a representative who was the dean of the University of Pennsylvania Law School. I believe his name was Harrison. We can look that up, but who Truman sent to the DP camps. And he couldn't get Congress to, lift the quotas, so he wanted to find other solutions for the Jews. And Harrison gave these surveys in one camp where he asked the Jews to essentially, write a list of the places they want to go to, so at least we know where they want, and maybe that's part of the beginning of a conversation about a solution. And he said, rank for me the 5 places you want to go from most to least. And it was something like 90% wrote on the first line Palestine, and then 90% wrote on the second line Palestine. And Harrison was annoyed because apparently Jews don't understand what surveys are. And so he gave a new one where he said, if not Palestine, where would you go? And 20% in this camp wrote gas chambers, or the crematorium, I think is what they wrote. In other words, if you want to talk about Zionism, not as an ideological construct that, we in, our modern cleverness and in our clever modern academia need to deconstruct, which is absolutely the function of academia, and have at it. But you want to talk about Zionism as a lived experience. Zionism begins 1897, right, when the first Zionist Congress meets with Herzl. Well, who is Herzl? What actually is Zionism? I have a bit of a cantankerous view on what Zionism is. There are all these idealistic Zionisms. There's the Echad Ha'am, who is one particular thinker from southern Ukraine, particular time, and he talks about a cultural kind of Zionism where the land of Israel becomes this cultural center of Jews. We don't even need a state necessarily. We need to be a light unto the nations by our cultural production. And then you have religious Zionists who talk about a messianic age, and you have communist Zionists, which is one of the main really streams of Zionism, who have that idealism. And then you have British aristocratic Zionists, and you have American Jewish Zionists, and you have all these different Zionists, and literally all of them meet at the casino next to the train station of Basel in 1897 for the first Zionist Congress. Herzl chose Basel because it was a train hub, and so it was easy for all these very disparate groups to meet. And it just tells you that the kind of diversity of Jews that and of Jewish ideals and ideas and cultures that rallied around this Zionist flag. Well, if all of these things are Zionisms, what the heck is actual Zionism? What unites them? What unites a religious Messianic Jew and a communist atheist, right? What is the unification? And the unifying principle is, and the reason Herzl is Herzl, is this sort of visionary is faces in every classroom in Israel. The reason Herzl manages to unite all these people is that Herzl delivers what is Zionism's heart and soul. And it is not a nationalist, identity. It is not a narrative of historical belonging. It is these things. All these things are part of Zionism. But the heart of Herzl is a strategic argument. And it's the argument that I'm going to obviously paraphrase and translate to modern times, but it is the argument that Europe is undergoing profound social changes. And those profound social changes of industrialization, urbanization, people are detaching from old identities and producing new identities. You are no longer from some tribe in Bavaria where you know all 200 people that you live with, from some village, right? You are now something called a German. And because of the economic changes that are happening in industrialization, the very pressures that create communism in the 19th century, they create new mass societies, new identities where suddenly you are something called a German, and there's millions of other Germans. You've never met them, but somehow you and they share this fated bond. And these new identities are forming that are essentially imagined communities. I mean, right? That's not I'm not saying they're bad or wrong or don't exist. Some of the most important things in our lives are imagined. We're a creature that can imagine a great deal of our institutions and states and money, et cetera. All famously, those are all imagined. But these new imagined communities are forming that Herzl warns they will police their boundaries. They will police their membranes. To be German, I'm going to take the extreme example, which is Adolf Hitler. And I just because the extreme is clarifying, but many, many other nationalisms had some version of this, less than Hitler. But why did Hitler hate the Jews? Why did Hitler hate the Jews more than he hated groups that in the Nazi racial hierarchy are lower than the Jews. He had a whole sophisticated, complex racial hierarchy. Why did he hate Jews more than Africans? Why did he hate Jews more than Southeast Asians? And his answer was essentially, this is obviously my paraphrase, but folks, read Mein Kampf. His answer essentially was people like Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein, who comes from Germany, he had Swiss citizenship, but he comes from, I think, the city of Ulm. Albert Einstein was a German in the morning and then a Jew in the afternoon. He was the great physicist of the German-speaking world, changed the whole world, created modern science, and then flew to, or took a boat to Jerusalem to found the Hebrew University of Jerusalem as a Jew. And so for someone like Hitler, for the Nazis who argued that Germanness, this thing we just made up in our imperial struggle against the French, and for some reason the Austrians maybe aren't entirely in it, but kind of are, different depending on your politics. This thing called Germanness actually is ancient and organic, and it's this tribe that came out of the dark forest, and it has this old nobility to it, and it is blood. People arguing that for the Jew to be able to be inside Germanness and then outside Germanness perforates that membrane. And so the Jew, by their very existence, by their capacity to have layered identities, are a threat to Germanness itself, something that no African could be. And so the Jew had to be exterminated. Herzl, in 1890s, predicts not the Holocaust. He spoke of the coming catastrophe. He probably was thinking something along the lines of the Russian Civil War that we talked about. Nowhere does he show that he thinks it's going to be literally a Holocaust of that scale. But he predicts that identity anxiety, that identity quandary that drives that anti-Semitism. And that itself is the organizing principle of Zionism. It is a simple principle. If you don't get out, a catastrophe is coming. You want to be communist, you want to be religious, you want to be American liberal, whatever you want to be, but get everybody out. And he says even that, the Jews are going to discover this 10 minutes too late. And he, at one point he says, I don't know if it's going to be expropriation from below, by which he means Marxists, or if it's going to be reactionary confiscation from above. I don't know if they're going to kill us, murder us, or expel us. I suspect it'll be all these things at once. That's a quote that he records in his diary after a meeting with the Rothschilds. This is what I told the Rothschilds. It was a fundraising meeting, so maybe he went a little over, but wow, what predictive power. Zionism warned.
This is 1902, 190.
I think it's early. I think it's in the. I think it's late 1890s.
Okay.
I have to look up the exact quote, but it's. I have it written down somewhere. But
my point is, it's not 1931.
But yeah, that's in. Yes, no, he's. I think he passes in 1904.
Yeah.
The Zionist movement is founded on this idea, the organizing idea, that over the next 45, 50 years after Herzl, Europe literally just lives out the Zionist warning. And so when Herzl gathers together the Jews in 1897, he represents a small minority of Jews. Zionism is not attractive. It's more attractive the closer you are to the pogrom. So it's quite attractive in the Russian-speaking East. It's not at all attractive to most Jews in Vienna, where Herzl lives. He went to the opera one evening, and the Jews at the opera publicly and openly and in a crowd mocked him, and he records this, mocked him and said, here comes the king of the Jews, right? A man who thinks he's going to now redeem the Jews and found the Jewish kingdom, right? And they're mocking him. And then all of these predictions just come to fruition.
So I want to bring us back to the DP camps and that survey. It's important to note, I think I may have done this in the Yossi Klein Halevi episode, but it's important to note this because it's a mistake that is commonly made. There is no country called Palestine in world history. There is a landscape, an area called Palestine that in 1945, in those DP camps, or 46 or 47, whenever Truman sent that representative, Palestine meant the land that the British controlled. In the aftermath of World War I, they get it in the aftermath of World War I from the Ottoman Empire. So there is no country called Palestine. There's a place, and it becomes the place in the Zionist movement. It takes a while, but eventually that's where the Zionist movement that begins formally as a political movement in 1897, it becomes focused very soon after that, with some stops and starts, on Palestine, the area under control of the Ottomans at the time in 1900 whenever, but then after World War I, starting in 1918, at the end of World War I, it becomes British. So in 1945, 46, 47, when Jews who had lived in Poland and Russia and Germany and who were Hungary, and to the extent there were still any left, or Italy or France, they wanted to go to Palestine. The problem was they couldn't get in. The British, just like the United States in 1921, would not let them in. They could not go there. There was no Jewish state. And the state that was there, what was called the British Mandate, meaning a territory governed by British rule, did not want to take in Jews, partly for a lot of reasons, but Britain was trying to, as we started to talk, I think talked a little bit about in the Yossi Klein Halevi episode, Britain's got a little problem. They have an indigenous Arab population in Palestine that they had promised some national hopes and aspirations to meet those if they aligned with them against the Turks, which they did in World War I. And those people are still waiting, 1946, 47, for the British to keep that promise. At the same time, there was another indigenous population, the Jews, smaller, but very, very eager to have their own land. Through 1917 was called the Balfour Declaration, and the 25 or 35, the Peel Commission. England is showing lots of signs of meeting Jewish national aspiration, but they will not do it. And that brings us to the aftermath of World War II, when Jews have no place to go, and they, as much as they might want to go to Palestine, they can't.
Yeah, the British in 1939 issued something they called the White Paper. 1939, because of a 3-year Arab revolt, which is suppressed brutally by Britain, there are estimates that 10% of the young men, the fighting age men of the Palestinian Arab population probably were either killed or expelled in that British repression of the Arab revolt. But it also flips Britain to the Arab side. In other words, Britain then says, okay, Palestine is not a solution for the Jews, which Britain had said partly because some of British leadership was a devout sort of Zionist Christian, and also because they didn't want Jews ending up in Britain, and the Jews were on the run. And so if we don't find a solution for them, they'll all come here. Britain pushed for a Jewish state of Israel, as it supported the Zionist movement, often for anti-Semitic reasons, as much as for actual Zionist reasons. All of that is true. The ordinary experience of ordinary Jews, which is, again, I think the driving force of history, is the ordinary experience of ordinary people. I'm interested in the ordinary experience of ordinary Arabs in this time. I'm interested in the ordinary experience of ordinary Jews in this time, was that as all of the gates are closing, the last gate closed in 1939, and that was the British Empire, literally on the eve of World War II, telling the Jews, even this last vestige, this Zionist hope, even this, we're taking away from you. That's how the Jews remember the British. And so when you, essentially as the last closed door funneling them into the gas chambers, which is the correct way to remember the British if you went through the gas chambers, right? With all due respect to now, everybody will try and say, yes, well, how could the British have known, et cetera, et cetera. If you didn't know this history that we've just described here, you didn't care. You weren't paying attention. It was more important to you that the Jews not land in Britain than whether they live or die. And so that's our memory of that period. In a weird way, that really does bring us to right now. That brings us to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a profound and immediate way, because this story of the Jews isn't the American Jewish story. It's not the story, the Jewish history as told by English-speaking Jews, for the simple reason that who are American Jews? They're the Jews who make it into America before 1921. And don't go through the 20th century that we just described. And who are the Israeli Jews? They're the Jews who do go through that history because they're the ones who couldn't get into America, or the West generally, after 1921. And so they include the Jews of Europe who literally couldn't move westward. And they include the Jews in the immediate aftermath of the founding of Israel in 1948. That same energy, that same mass expulsion, mass flight of all the Jews from the East, the uninhabitability to Jews that sweeps through Europe, that begins to sweep through the Arab and Muslim worlds. And you suddenly see hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Jews, probably as many as 800,000 in about 4 years, landing in Israel, almost the entirety of the Jewish community of Iraq. Baghdad in 1930, I believe, is about 25% Jewish. That's about double the rate of New York City. Baghdad, 22 years later, is 0% Jewish. No Jew could remain. Anti-Zionist Iraqi nationalist Jews all fled. And over the course of the 50s and into the 60s a little bit, the Jews in North Africa completely empty out, some to France, most to Israel. And that's true of the Jews of Yemen and the Jews of Syria and the Jews of Egypt. And Israel suddenly, its Jewish population of about 700,000 at its founding, at the Declaration of Independence, becomes 1.3 million Jews within 4 years. And so Israel becomes the only place you can leave. And the only reason the Jews of the Arab world didn't experience what the Jews of Europe experienced, if not a Holocaust itself, because what state in the Middle East would have been competent enough to produce a Holocaust on an industrial Nazi level at that time, but certainly everything leading up to the Holocaust. The reason the Jews didn't experience that was simply because they had somewhere to go to. And that was the big difference. And so the Jews of Israel, I have an argument to Palestinians, and I engage with Palestinians constantly, and I try to make this argument. And I'm usually shut down or ignored for reasons that I think are absolutely fascinating in themselves. But my argument to Palestinians is that the strategy that Palestinians have pursued, anti-colonial terrorism, anti-colonial violence, it's a strategy modeled on other anti-colonial conflicts.
Including, it's important to note, the Jewish response to the British here in Palestine between 1945 and 48. The Jews viewed, strangely enough, the British as the colonialists. They have a long history of that. And the Jews so many who had lived here for centuries, a small group, and many who had been able to fight their way here through those closed gates, which a few did, they made life miserable for the British. And the British finally in 1948 said, we've had enough. We wipe our hands. UN in 1947, they said to the UN, you fix this. They dropped the partition we talked about with Yossi Klein Halevi, 55% to the Jews, 45% to the indigenous Arabs here. But the 55% the Jews gets mostly desert. It's not very attractive. But either way, Israel was happy. The Jews were happy to take it. The Arabs said, no, we don't want any Jews near us or any Jews on this land. And they instead launched the invasion of the country. Right. The anti-colonial terror, that brings us to the anti-colonial terrorism that has run through tragically, I think, for both Israelis and Palestinians for the last 70 years, whatever you want to call it. So go ahead, continue.
Yeah, I mean, the colonialist paradigm is arguably one of the founding concepts of a Palestinian Arab identity. In other words, from the 1910s, from 1914 and 1908, with the young Turkish revolution that ousts the Sultan in the Ottoman Empire, the imperial censorship is lifted, and suddenly Arabs all over the Arab world under Ottoman rule have a free press for some period of time. And what you end up seeing is that they found these newspapers and begin talking out loud, and you suddenly discover that they are concerned with Jewish immigration. Now, Jewish immigration in 1914 is minuscule. It's a few tens of thousands of people. It's not massive. It's not endangering them, but they understand it in the framework of a larger context. So during the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire is the Ottoman Empire's greatest threat. They'd fought 4 major wars, including wars in the 1880s that were conquer wars. The Russians conquered large parts of the Balkans from the Ottomans very, very recently. And Arab elites in Jerusalem, in Beirut, in Haifa, in these cities and towns of this region saw themselves as Ottoman elites. They saw themselves as, the Ottoman Empire had ruled here for 400 years. There'd never been any other political order, right, in living memory. And so they understood these Russian-speaking Jews not as as refugees fleeing the Russian Empire. But they spoke of them as agents of the Tsar, agents of the Tsarist regime. When Jews begin to flee other parts of Europe, they think in these, they try to frame these Jewish arrivals as imperial arrivals. The numbers start ticking up after the early 20s when the doors closed to the West, ticking up dramatically. I mean, in the first 40 years after 1881, when 2.5 million Jews go to America, maybe 50,000 total over 40 years went to the land of Israel, all told. The Zionist movement was a minority view among Jews, right up until it wasn't. When wasn't it? In 1935 alone, just that 1 year, 65,000 German-speaking Jews arrived in Israel. And so they're refugees, right? That's the point. They are fleeing. But whenever they flee, there was a big debate among the Jews. They had founded this technical college called the Technion, which is in the 20s, I believe, which is today Israel's MIT. It's the finest technological school in Israel. And there was a big debate over whether it would teach in Yiddish or whether it would teach in Hebrew. And the reason it was a debate was that Hebrew was a religious language. It was spoken. It was known. Rabbis could write letters to each other across different cultural gaps and linguistic worlds in Hebrew, but it was limited essentially to religion. It didn't have a vocabulary. It was about 80,000 words all told. It didn't have a vocabulary for discussing quantum physics. And so if you're going to found the Technion and it spoke Hebrew, you'd need new Hebrew words for quantum physics, right? And the decision was made to go with Hebrew. Now, Palestinian Arabic press followed that debate among the Jews. How did it follow that debate among the Jews? Palestinians discussed whether the Jews, if they chose the Germanic Yiddish, then the Germanness and the German nationalism and the German imperial cause that really secretly sent all these German-speaking Jews here was winning out. And if they went with Hebrew, then this Hebrew nationalist cause was winning. In other words, they looked at us and imposed on us for a century now all kinds of intellectual models that made sense to their experience and that made sense to their experience of us, but had nothing to do with our actual experience. And that has been going on for 100 years. So if you want to understand the October 7th massacre by Hamas of 1,200 Israelis in such a brutal way, you need to understand the model that Hamas is using to understand us. And that model is Algeria. In 1962, after 8 horrific years of a horrifying terrorist war by the National Liberation Front of Algeria against the French, it is absolutely critical to say the French army in that war was even more brutal than the FLN fighters. In other words, they probably killed 400,000 or 500,000 Algerian civilians, and that's what historians think. The Algerian sort of national story has a number that's even higher than that. Horrific war by both sides, and the war was successful. The French had begun to settle Algeria in the 1830s. By 1954, the French had been there for about 120 years, and there were 1.5 million white French Europeans there. Algeria was declared a département of the French Republic. It was part of France. It sent representatives to the French Parliament in Paris. But even though it was this department of the French Republic, the France never extended citizenship to the 5 or 6 million Algerian Muslims living in Algeria. And so in 1954, the Algerian Muslim civil society organizations or various political groups get together and form this unified National Liberation Front that launches this horrific terror war. And after 8 years, in 1962, a miracle happens. The French just get up and leave. There's tremendous, it overthrows French politics. It brings de Gaulle to power, the Algeria War. It's this momentous time, not just in Algerian history, but in French history. But it works. Every French diplomat, every French bureaucrat, every French soldier, every French man, woman, and child gets on a boat back to France. That's 1962. In 1964, drawing from that experience, the Palestinian political factions get together in a room and form the Palestine Liberation Organization, modeled on the National Liberation Front. Anti-colonial conflicts, anti-colonial struggles basically share one the violent ones, basically share one sort of strategic paradigm. And the strategic paradigm is very, very simple. The colonialist shows up in your country for some benefit that they perceive. Give that benefit the value of X. How do you get rid of them? You create a cost that is higher than X. And now, again, that the colonialist perceives to be higher than X. We're talking about hacking the colonialist psychology. The higher the cost, if it's X plus 1, they'll eventually leave. If it's X plus 300, they'll leave very quickly. And so anti-colonial struggles, by their basic logic, tend to horrific cruelty, tend to terrorism. Not because colonized peoples are more cruel than anybody else, but because that is the basic founding logic of anti-colonial struggles, and it worked everywhere. It worked everywhere it was tried in the 20th century. And so the Palestinians look at, the Jews of Israel in 1964, and they say, well, they've been here a long time. The French were there a long time. There are many of them. There were many French. And they launched this conflict. Now, they'd already been talking about a colonialist, anti-colonialist conflict in the 30s, the Great Arab Revolt in 1929. Even in 1920, there was an organized Palestinian massacre of Jews. But it becomes systematized and ideologized in the 1960s under Yasser Arafat in the PLO. The generations that grew up in that paradigm. By the way, the connection is profound. In 1974, Arafat gives a speech at the UN General Assembly. Who introduces him to the podium? The president of the assembly, who's also the president of Algeria, who was also a leader in the FLN. In 1988, the Palestinians Arafat issues a Palestinian Declaration of Independence. By the way, on November 15th, 1988, Yasser Arafat declares independence of the state of Palestine. Where does he do it? In Algiers. Palestinian school children learn the Algerian experience. And that drives decades of terrorism, of raids across the border, of mass murders, of shooting up school buses of Israeli children, of the Second Intifada, 140 bombings, of airplane hijackings, and also
the
ultimately
murder of the 1972 Israeli Olympians.
Yeah, absolutely. The 1972 Munich massacre, the Olympic massacre, and the October 7th, 2023 just rampage. Horrific, brutal rampage. Why, if you're Hamas and you have the chance to murder Israeli civilians, why would you do it in the most horrific ways imaginable? Why would you do it and film it? Why would you do it and broadcast it to the Israelis? Hamas went through several stages. First, it filmed it, live streamed it, gloried in it, delighted and danced and had, right, and Hamas supporters, by the way, overseas, gloried in it and were joyful. The protests in support of Hamas began long before the Israeli bombardment of Gaza began. It wasn't about Palestinian suffering. It was about Palestinian success at the beginning, certainly at the beginning. And the reason is, again, that Hamas understands the basic conflict as raising the cost, and eventually the colonialist leaves. Why hasn't it worked?
Because, as Golda Meir said, we have no place to go.
We have no place to go. This is not a shallow point, and it's not an ideological point. It's not that Zionist ideology tells us we have no place to go. It's not that I tell my children that they're part of this imagined community. All nations are imagined. Is there even such a thing as a nation? It's not any of those kinds of ideational, elitist kinds of conceptions. We have no place to go in both the historical experience sense and in the literal current political sense. Where do we come from? 50% of us come from the Arab world. 50% of the Jews, most Israeli citizens are Arabs. If 50% of the Israeli Jews are Arabs and all the Israeli Arabs are Arabs, that's 70% of 65% of Israelis. I'm not good at math. That's why I went into the humanities. But it's we belong in the Middle East more than in anywhere else. What does that mean? That means that if you want to kick us out like the French back to France, you have to have a very serious conversation with the Baghdadis, because about a third of the real estate of Baghdad belongs to Jews who were forced to flee. Are you really sending? Yeah.
But not anymore. There's no, just like Palestinian refugees in Gaza, whether they're literal refugees from 1948 or their descendants, or Palestinians in the West Bank, they can often point to where they lived in Israel. Those places are now owned and lived in by Jews, and most of those Jews are happy there and don't want to give them back. But a sticking point in this conflict for decades has been what is called the law of return, that Palestinians demand the right to reclaim their lost property, lost birthright, heritage. And I understand that. It's a very powerful and urge that needs to be respected. But it's a weird thing, of course, that the 50+% of Israeli Jews who fled from Arab lands, they're not going back. First of all, they don't want to.
No, but also nobody claims that right for them.
And no one claims it.
The Palestinians have a unique request, not a return to a state, which quite a few nations have. There's a kind of right of return in Greece. There's a kind of right of return in Ireland. Read the Irish Constitution. There's a special dispensation given for fast-tracking naturalization for people of Irish heritage. But nobody has a right of return to a geography in another state. That is a unique demand by the Palestinians, and nobody claims it for the Jews who are displaced in the same place, in the same conflicts at the same time.
Yeah, I called it the law of return. That's a different thing. It's the right of return. In the middle of this very challenging moment for many, many people in 2023, protesters around the world in sympathy with Palestinians or in antipathy to Israel have suggested that the Jews, when they say, for example, from the river to the sea, which means the country we currently call Israel should be under Islamic sovereignty. And it's worth pointing out that in the aftermath of October 7th, most Israeli Arabs, meaning people who are Muslims, not as opposed to, say, Israelis who came from Arab countries. Most Israeli Arabs here have, I think it's 70%, are in support of the Jewish state's actions against Hamas and are horrified at what happened. And one reason is they probably don't want to live under Hamas. But from the river to the sea, that includes where they're living in many cities in Israel. They don't want to be part of that. But when people have been confronted who are chanting from the river to the sea, well, where would the Jews go who currently live between the river and the sea? And they say, well, they should go back to where they're from. And when asked, they have sometimes said, like Brooklyn. Well, most of Israel's 7 million Jews are not from Brooklyn. They're from Baghdad or Yemen or Morocco or Teaneck. And they could go back. In theory, I could go back. I have 2 passports, but I don't want to go back particularly. And most Jews who live here can't go back because there's nowhere to go back to. So what you're highlighting, and this is something I didn't fully appreciate, is that this colonial narrative, this anti-colonial narrative and this anti-colonial strategy of Palestinian terrorism is wildly at odds with the Jewish narrative. Now, with Yossi Klein Halevi, we talked about the 2 narratives of 1948, for example. The Jewish narrative is, we'd been here a while, had a chance to stay, we were attacked, we fought, we won, we gained more territory. In 1967, we were attacked, we won, we gained more territory. The Palestinian narrative is, in 1948, we're minding our own business. The UN declared a state. We didn't get a say. The world voted. Nations attacked Israel. We were expelled. Now, some of them were expelled. Some of them chose to leave and then found they couldn't come back or didn't want to come back. And they were put into refugee camps. So those are 2 narratives that don't work very well together. They're a zero-sum game, more or less. Only one nation can live from the river to the sea as sovereigns. Right now, it's Israel as a Jewish state. The Palestinians, many want it to be a Palestinian or Islamic state. That's a zero-sum game. And Yossi Klein Halevi's brilliant, I think, book and empathetic book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, makes the point that each side's going to have to give a part of their narrative, and that's worth doing so our children can live in peace and we don't have to die. But now there's a second narrative, the second set of narratives that don't work. that is the Hamas and violent part of the Palestinian movement that says, oh, I know how we get this land back. We just make it really uncomfortable for these people to live here, not recognizing that cost-benefit analysis doesn't quite work for us because we don't have anywhere else to go, most of us. And
right. I'll say more than that. It's not just that we have nowhere else to go. Now go back to everything we talked about at the beginning. Our foundational lesson, the idea at the heart of our identity, what it means to be Israeli, more than any other thing that it could possibly mean, is that nothing is safe. Nothing is anything but precarious, except being on our own terms, self-reliant in our own land. The founding of Israel is the day we stopped dying, literally. And so if that is the meaning of Israeliness, and it's a meaning so foundational. I once heard an anthropologist explain to me that there's a thing in anthropology called a big idea. A big idea is an assumption so large, so vast, so universally shared, nobody ever talks about it. And so we don't even notice that we all share this huge assumption until we meet a culture that's exotic and different from us and doesn't share it, and then we don't understand what they're talking about, right? The big idea, the fish doesn't know it's swimming in water, right? Because it's just breathing. That water that we swim in as Israelis is that ark. And it's an ark that American Jews can't see. Never mind me asking the Muslim world or the Palestinians or liberal Europe to see. It is the Israeli Jewish experience that in the English-speaking language, in English-speaking discourse, certainly in English-speaking academia, is almost entirely absent from the discourse. And it is why the anti-colonial paradigm has done horrific damage to the Palestinians for two reasons. One, I can't give them what they want. In other words, they're exacting a cost for me. And the idea of this kind of pressure, of all pressure, terrorism, sanctions, social shaming, all pressure, the idea is if you change your behavior, the pressure ends. But they're asking for me to change a behavior that is literally who and what I am. It's my one historical lesson from a century of genocide. And so the anti-colonial paradigm doesn't work on me. I'm immune to terrorism, not because I'm brave and courageous and macho and tall and handsome. Obviously, we Israelis are all those things, but that's not what made us immune to terrorism. And because Palestinians don't know that, don't have a theory of mind of us, their discourse, go into their discourse, study it, learn it, empathize with it. You will not find in their discourse an empathetic journey, a self-critical, serious analysis of our story and our experience. You're going to find a lot of excuses. You're going to find a lot of cheap sort of psychologizing. Well, we're the victims of the victims, the Palestinians sometimes say. In other words, the Israelis were victimized by the Europeans, and what do? Family system psychology, you end up traumatizing your own kids the way your parents traumatized you. That's what's happening. That's super cheap, psychologizing. I wouldn't do that to Palestinians. I don't expect them to do it to me. There is a good reason they cling to the anti-colonial paradigm. And by the way, everything we've seen on college campuses in the West, everything we've seen from these rallies is this: decolonization. Students at Harvard or Stanford screaming decolonization. This is what we meant by decolonization after the massacre of 1,200 Israelis. What did you think we meant? Yeah, exactly. This is 1960s anti-colonial theory. They were all forced to read Frantz Fanon, who was this doctor who worked with the FLN and wrote this book called The Wretched of the Earth, which had a profound effect on the global left. What's fascinating about this pro-Hamas cutting-edge American university ideology is that it's 60 years old. It's incredibly old and boring, and it's already decimated the Palestinian cause because they're coming at me and demanding something that doesn't make any sense. And From the River to the Sea is the same story. Rashida Tlaib, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, wants us to believe that means from the river to the sea, everybody's going to have a vote and we're all going to be a civic democracy like America. And if you don't think that that's what it means, you're a racist. The only problem is in Arabic, including in Western marches, in Arabic, the translation, the text translated from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, is from the river to the sea, Palestine will be Arab. And that's it's a quote from Hamas's charter. And it is not about establishing a civic democracy. It is about the anti-colonial paradigm. If you're a Palestinian, that anti-colonial paradigm still to this day promises you absolute complete redemption. The Jews will leave. Just have faith. And that's Hamas's popularity. What does Hamas say to Palestinians? It says to Palestinians, we are believers. There is a just God, and the just God oversees a just arc to history. And so to make peace with this evil called colonialism that the Jews represent is to not believe in a just God who oversees a just history.
So it's, I think, deeply insightful and deeply disturbing at the same time. Where does that leave us? We haven't talked about it in detail in the program. I don't know if we will, but certainly in the run-up to October 7th, Israeli society was on the verge of civil war, I felt. We had people fighting each other on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, secular and religious Jews in Tel Aviv. We had pilots refusing to train because they did not like the proposed judicial reforms. We had a minority coalition in charge that pushed a variety of things that the majority of the country did not want. And we looked like we were falling apart. And certainly many people, many Israelis talked about leaving, going somewhere else. Not necessarily back home, because maybe there wasn't a home they could go back to, but somewhere else. Most of them, I think, were thinking about the United States or Canada. And the most horrific atrocities perpetrated on Jews since the Holocaust happens on October 7th. And all of a sudden, you and I are living in an extraordinary moment of history of an amazing unity, an unbelievable pulling together as a country that, I've never experienced in my lifetime, having spent the first 67 years in the United States. It's not working, as you say. It's not achieving. The violence is not achieving, at least so far, what the Palestinians had achieved, hoped it would achieve, or what previous liberation movements had achieved. There is an alternative, by the way, which is the nonviolent strategy that India followed in liberating itself from colonial rule and other places, but usually takes some kind of violence. America is a perfect example. 1776 was a war that brought about the freedom of the United States. So where does that leave us? We are more determined. I like the metaphor. It's a cheap metaphor, but I think it's profound, of the sun and the wind having a debate about who's stronger. And they say, well, let's see who's stronger. There's a man walking down there below us with a coat on. I bet I can get him to take his coat off, says the wind. And he blows and he blows, and the wind blows, and the man just clutches his coat tighter. The sun comes out from behind a cloud. The man's hot, and he takes his coat off. The sun wins. Well, Hamas and the Palestinian terrorist movements that exist alongside them and before them, and I fear will come after them, they're the wind. They keep blowing and blowing, and we just clutch our coat tighter, and we say, we live here. We're not going anywhere. We'll fight. We'll die for the right to stay here, partly because we don't have anywhere else to go or don't want to go anywhere else, and partly because we believe we belong here. We have a different narrative. You gave the one about running away. That's our foundational narrative, but it's more than that. There's a religious piece to it, of course, that's part of it that runs alongside that. This is the place we are meant to be as Jews. So those are really strong, those two together. But the Palestinians have not given up. They keep pushing, and they exact very, very, very painful costs on the Jews who live here, but also on their own people. Hard to be a Palestinian in Gaza. We're seeing the 300 miles of tunnels that exist under Gaza that Western aid and others have given to Gaza in the name of humanitarian assistance. It's been used to create military infrastructure. So, you got any cheerful thoughts for me, Haviv? This is
I hesitate
we're just going to keep going.
I hesitate to be optimistic in the Middle East, but you want to understand the Israeli-Arab phenomenon you referenced earlier. Arab-Israeli identification with Israel is at an all-time high. I think the last poll was 72%. It's never been that high. Why? And that's because of October 7th. In other words, it's spiked massively. I think more than 10 points since October 7th. What the
I
heck
just
is
want to
happening there?
I just want to remind listeners: Arab Israelis are people who live within the borders of Israel. They're not on the West Bank. They're not in Gaza. They have either didn't flee in 1948, or they found themselves here, and their children and grandchildren are still here. They have equal rights with the Jewish population. They have many things that are, I think, very tragic. They don't get very good education. They have, I think, inadequate police protection against violence. But they're torn because, to some extent, they do not identify with the Zionist project. Understandably, they're not Jews. They're Muslims or other forms of non-Jewish religions. So they've been torn. But right now, they're very much identifying with the state of Israel, at least in the moment. Carry on.
Right. We have tremendous research into the Israeli-Arab identity over the decades. It fascinates academics because these are people who are Palestinian and Israeli and Muslim and Arab living in a majority Jewish state. And so they are people with a very layered and complex identity who engage deeply with the Israeli body politic. They're in every Israeli university in huge numbers. They work in Israeli industry. They increasingly are seen in the Israeli judiciary and in the Israeli high-tech industry. And they also have this Palestinian identity. And one of the things that we're seeing of late, certainly in the last month, in a profound way, we're seeing it also in civil society. Arab Israeli civil society has come out in support of the victims' families. Arab Israeli politicians have been outspoken about Hamas's atrocities. And all of that while they're watching fellow Palestinians in Gaza suffering horrifically. And what actually is happening there, I think, is the collapse. Hamas has expedited, they speak Hebrew. They know us in a way that Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank don't know us. They don't speak Hebrew. And they know what just happened to us. And they know what just awoke in us. The Hamas massacre, in which for the Israelis, the great trauma wasn't the specific murder of a specific child. The great trauma was the feeling of helplessness, because that brings back Kishinev. That brings back old, deep, primordial Jewish thoughts and experiences that created who we are now 100 years ago. You want to understand Kishinev in the Israeli experience, in the Jewish experience, certainly in the Zionist Jewish experience, but generally in the Jewish memory, read Bialik's poem. It's called In the City of Slaughter. And it's available in English in excellent translations over the years. It evoked that. To the Israeli Arab who speaks Hebrew and knows us deeply and works with us and studies with us at university. And many serve in the army. I was in the infantry. I had a platoon commander who was Arab. To
Not
them,
Arab Jewish, not one of the Jews who fled from Baghdad.
Not Mizrahi Jewish, yes. Arab, Palestinian, Israeli Arab, yes. Muslim even. But there's also a Christian minority among Israeli Arabs. But to them, the anti-colonial paradigm no longer makes sense. And it no longer makes sense, not because they don't wish it was true, although I think they don't wish it was true. I really think that identification with Israel is authentic and long-standing. Even as, Western liberal support for Palestinians turns radical 1960s anti-colonialist 3 generations late and in ways that are only going to keep Palestinians, bashing themselves into the same brick wall that Yasser Arafat kept them bashing into. Even as that's happening inside Israeli society, the 20% of Israeli society, this is an enormous minority, is increasingly saying, yeah, these Jews aren't going anywhere. And therefore, this is our polity. This is our country. We need to take a place of responsibility and respect. We need to demand better police protection, better investment by the government. We need to go to sit in the cabinet table and not skip out on Israeli politics because we, are still committed to the Palestinian national cause, or just generally we're anti-Zionist in some way. There's a deep shift, and it's the deep shift happening when the anti-colonial paradigm falls apart, and you just conclude that Israel just isn't going anywhere. So that's one aspect. You want to understand us. the last year provides a really powerful lens for really understanding the significance, the meaning, the power of the experience we've been talking about this whole podcast, which is those soldiers, right? What the heck happened? 11 months ago, very few Israelis really had any strong opinion about judicial reform. And then 9 months ago, the whole country was on fire over judicial reform. When that kind of a shift happens suddenly, it's a good hint that the judicial reform debate itself was not about judicial reform. It was a proxy fight for something else.
I so agree.
How did the opposition to the government's judicial reform proposal, how did it manifest itself? It manifested itself in part in the, I would say, more activist, radical part, but it was quite popular. It manifested itself as Israelis getting up and saying, I'm no longer going to train. I no longer am going to serve. If this country isn't democratic, I'm not a soldier of this country anymore. Now, what was that? What was that? Now, I argued at the time, don't worry. Luckily, I wrote it and I said it a podcast on my newspaper, so I get to point to it and I get to say, I told you so. But I said at the time, don't worry. Every single one of them is going to go to war. Now, one of those pilots who's saying, I'm not going to fly anymore, is going to look at their kid when Nasrallah attacks. I thought it would be Nasrallah before Hamas. I was wrong on that. But
that's Hezbollah.
That's north. Hezbollah in the north, right? And when Hezbollah attacks with its 150,000 rockets, not one pilot is going to look at their kid and say, I'm sorry, I'm not flying against those rockets because judicial reform. That simply is not a thing that's going to happen. But what it actually was a language, a vocabulary through which Israelis talk about the single most sacred principle of their civic religion, which is the solidarity and the safety that Israel represents. And so what those people were saying was, dear right-wingers, Netanyahu supporters who support this judicial reform, we want you to know that what you think is ordinary politics or populist politics or sort of the American sort of Trump versus Biden kind of moment, we want you to know that is not what this is, that we're experiencing this as a fracture of something real and deep and profound and fundamental. How do I tell you, one Israeli to another, that something fundamental is fracturing? I talk about our mutual defense of each other, because that's all we are in this world. That is our heart and soul. You can, as an Israeli, be ultra-Orthodox, and you can be secular, liberal, and you can be every kind of thing in the middle and in between, and all things you want. As long as we protect each other, the founding idea holds us together. That is our civic religion. Now, that is not shallow. That is not weak. That does not mean we don't have a strong identity identifying us with this land. There's a reason Yemenites came here and encountered German Jews and said, hello, brothers. All of our story of ourselves is real. But what gives it that urgency and that power generation after generation is that protection, is that self-reliance, is that shared faith and solidarity. That's what you're breaking. As soon as Hamas's attack happened, and it was at Kishinev 25 times, again, I'm not good at math, but it was, I believe, 24 Kishinevs in terms of the scale. Every single one of those pilots, every single one of those infantrymen who signed those petitions, every single one of the thousands of soldiers who said, I will no longer serve, every single one volunteered to show up. There was actually, at the beginning of the war, a huge shortage of supplies, of combat supplies, helmets, vests, and we went and looked up, why was the army unprepared for a reserve call-up? And it turned out that the army had a reserve call-up, and something like 25% too many people showed up. In other words, people just were knocking down the army's doors, begging to get in, begging to do their part, begging to serve and help. That unity you're describing, that's the flip side of the language they were using to say, hey, our unity is threatened in the judicial reform fight, which was what the discussion of I won't serve really was about. It's how Israelis talk about fundamental things. And so, welcome to Israel, right, dear listener? The unity is the real thing. Israelis were falling apart as a society because they thought they were safe. And Hamas told them, you're not safe. And Hamas is absolutely convinced now, at this moment, says it publicly, openly, discusses it on Al Arabiya and Al Jazeera, is absolutely convinced that telling us once again that we're not safe is what's eventually going to drive us out. And because they don't have any curiosity about our actual lived experience, our actual identity, how we actually interpret anti-colonial violence. You want to call me a colonialist? Call me a colonialist. If it makes you happy, it makes you feel good, it makes you feel righteous, enjoy. I really hope it makes Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib a happy person. But as a strategic idea, it's guaranteed to fail. Because I respond to anti-colonial violence in the opposite way that every single colonialist project in the 20th century responded to anti-colonial violence, because I was produced by the opposite experience. There's this wonderful, I just finished with this, I apologize for just long ranting, but there's this book by an Israeli academic, anti-Zionist academic from Ben Gurion University in the South, Oren Iftachel, and he has a book in which he considers Zionism to be colonialism. And at one point in the book, he has a little footnote. And it's this adorable footnote. It's maybe my favorite footnote in all the history of all academic readings I've ever read. Because in this footnote, he says, I'm paraphrasing, I apologize, but I can look it up. In this footnote, he says, Zionism is absolutely unquestionably colonialism. There's no doubt about it. There are, he says, a few discrepancies between Zionism and what it would be considered maybe classical colonialism, but nevertheless, it still holds. It is still colonialism. And do you know what those discrepancies were? Discrepancy one, for example, it's not primarily an economic project. Most colonialism was. Discrepancy two, just about everyone who came to Israel can be classified for one reason or another as a refugee. Again, not typical of colonialism. Discrepancy three, there's a long-standing Jewish tradition of deep belonging to this land. Again, not usually present in colonialism. Discrepancy four. And he goes on, and it's eventually you just ask yourself, what's the diagnostic power of the word anymore? Other than the fact that I have a deep, long-standing tradition of connection to this land, other than the fact, one of them is I come from dozens of mother countries, not a single mother country. Other than that, other than my being a refugee,
there's been a Jewish presence here for 2,000 years.
He didn't mention that, but it is true. But what have you just said about me by calling me colonialist? And I think that the point is what you've said about me is your own loyalty to the Palestinian narrative, which is fine. I am a big believer in, everybody finding their own intellectual path. But you've just not described me in any way that I recognize by using the term, because you have to make so many footnotes to cut out so much of what colonialism actually is. To my point, I don't care what the world thinks about me. I'm a Zionist. That's the first thing we're taught. The world is not going to save you. Don't worry about what it believes. But I care deeply what Palestinians think about me, because my children's future will be deeply affected by the decision of Palestinians to remain on the anti-colonial path, or their decision to maybe seek a different path, a better path. A path that, not better in terms of what I want them to do, just literally a path that'll work. The anti-colonial path is a path that I cannot satisfy. I cannot satisfy that demand, even if they convince me they're right. In other words, what's astonishing to me about the anti-colonial paradigm that they don't understand is that I can concede to them literally everything their narrative claims about me. I can concede all of it. You want to call this a crime and that a crime? You want to say the entirety of the Nakba was a pre-planned conspiracy?
The Nakba being the term that the Palestinians use to describe the establishment of the Jewish state. It means catastrophe or disaster, right?
Right. And some of them talk about it as referring to the mass displacement of several 100,000 Palestinians in 48, 49. Some of them don't refer to the displacement. The Nakba specifically refers to the establishment of Israel. And it is ongoing, and it will only end when Israel is destroyed. Nakba is this complex, nuance. How you understand Nakba within Palestinian conversation tells me a lot about sort of where you stand in Palestinian ideological narratives and stories. But the point is, there is this Palestinian claim that it was all pre-planned, a pre-planned, essentially, expulsion, mass ethnic cleansing. I can even concede, I think that's absolutely untrue. I think all the evidence says otherwise. But I'll concede it strategically because it still doesn't matter. You still can't remove me. Even if I become a Palestinian nationalist, I don't know how to remove myself. I don't have anywhere to go. And so the Palestinians need a new story. And they need a new story. If you're pro-Palestinian, you have to be able to grasp that. And if you're pro-Israel, you have to be able to grasp that. They need a new story, not of them. I'm not coming to Palestinians and saying, re-understand your history the way I want you to. I'm coming to them and saying, please try and interpret me in a way that has any connection at all to my actual historical experience. You misunderstand me. And that has hurt you disastrously, catastrophically.
My guest today has been Haviv Rettig Gur. Haviv, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thanks for having me.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.